Casty here. I want to talk today about using JSON data in a database, which is sometimes a useful thing to do if you want to store complex Python data structures in a database, which we want to do for our assignment. So first, to introduce JSON a little bit and sort of give you the main idea, I've just got my PyCharm editor here. I'm just going to go to a console session and import the JSON module from Python. JSON is the acronym stands for JavaScript Object Notation, but it's a way of turning complex data structures into string values so that we can exchange them between applications and maybe store them in databases, which is what we're going to try and do here. Let me just make a little Python data structure. Here's a list. So my little list A has got 3 numbers in it. And if I want to store that in a file in a way that I can read back in, or store it somewhere, or send it to someone in a way that they can use, I could actually sort of print it out like that and read it back in, or print it in some other format. But JSON allows me to essentially turn it into a string value like this. So let me call that a sub j equals, okay, so a sub j is now a string, and it's a string containing the list 1, 2, 3. Now it looks just like it does in Python. So here's the Python version printed out, and there's the JSON version. It's really just a string version of that. It's got quotes around it, so that's how you know it's a string. I can print it, and that's what I get. And in fact, if I print A, I get exactly the same thing. But this a sub j is a string version of it, and A is obviously a list. So I can say A 0 is 1, and A sub j 0 is the open square bracket. So A sub j here is the string version. Now the reason we turn it into a string is that we want to save it somewhere. The reason it looks just like the Python string is that JavaScript is very similar to Python and actually represents data structures in pretty much the same way. And so many of the things you'll see actually just look like Python data structures. I can also do it for other data structures. So if I make a dictionary, so A here is a dictionary, and A hello equals 1, 2, 3, and A goodbye equals 3, 4, 5. And now A is this dictionary here. And if I use the dump string function again, what I get back is this thing here. Now the only difference you'll see is that in the JSON version we've got double quotes around the property names, and in the Python version there are single quotes, but everything else it's exactly the same. So we can use JSON dumps to store a Python data structure as a string value. That's basically the basis of what we're doing. Now let's move to the database. I'm just going to write a little script here, which is just a little demo script. I've created a database table with a little database with a table called samples. And samples contain 2 fields. The first is a name, which is a text field, and it's a unique primary key. So this is going to be a name for a piece of data. And then the second field is a data field, and that's going to be text. All right. And so what I want is I want to store a piece of data, and I want to store it against a name. And I'm going to write 2 functions. So I've got my create table. So I'm going to write 2 functions. One is to get a sample, and the other one is to set a sample. And set a sample takes a name and a piece of data, and we'll store it in the database. And get sample takes a name and retrieves the bit of data. And this is how I want to use it. I've got a bit of sample code here. I want to say set sample in my database, so Steve, and I want to store a list. So just some Python data structure, there's going to be a list. And here, Diego, I'm going to store another list. And then I want to get the sample out here, and I want to just print them out. And then I'm going to update it there and print it out. So it's a fairly simple, just store something in the database. So I can, let's write a simple naive version of these. So what I want to do is select data from samples where name equals whatever. And so I'm going to now get my cursor, and I'm going to execute my SQL, and with the name as the parameter, which is going to go where the question mark goes. So that's my one parameter. And now the result is going to be cur.fetch1. I'm only expecting one result because names are unique in the database, so I should only be able to get one result. So I use fetch1 to get the result. And now we need to test the result. So if the thing was in the database, then I want to return it. And result data will be the result. Now I'm using, here you can see with my database connection, I'm using the SQLite row factory, which means that I can access the results of my query using these dictionary-like methods, which makes it a lot neater. And then we need to decide when it's not in the database what to return. Well, I'm just going to return an empty list. Just in that case. So if it's not in the database, I'll just return an empty list as the result. So that's my first implementation of the get routine to actually get a piece of data from the database. Notice I'm not using JSON just yet because we're going to experiment with this first. And the next one is to set a sample. So let's so to set the sample, we're going to insert into samples, name and data, values, and then 2 question marks. And again, I'm going to get my cursor and cursor.execute SQL with the 2 values, name and data. And then we're going to commit. Okay, we're going to commit that change, and so that should add the data into the database. So it just adds whatever I give it into the database. So now we can try running this this routine. I'm going to just comment out this one here. Oh no, well it's going to not work anyway. So I can try running this, run main, and we see immediately the bug that we've got here. It says in set sample, it says error binding parameter 1, probably an unsupported type. And the reason is the parameter 1 there, so this is here where we're trying to get the data. Parameter is data, which is a list. Right, we're trying to set the data to be a list, and in fact the data type is their text, and we don't have a list data type in our SQL type, so we can't store lists in the database is what it says. So I need to do something else. I need to say let's turn it into a string. So what I'm going to do is JSON dumps. So dump s is dump a string data. So now data underscore j is my JSON version of the data, and that I can store in the database, right? So now we could try running this again and see what we get. So in fact we get a crash a little bit later on. Let me just comment that one out because all right, so now we actually get it working, right? So this other one is about updating. We get it working because when we retrieve the data, we get the results, the things that I stored. let's try and do something else. And so let's take Steve. So Steve.append, and I want to append another number, say 6, to the list. And then I'm going to print Steve again. Okay, see what happens now. What happens now is here I'm getting an error because a string object has no attribute append. Because what we did was we stored a JSON dumps of our string, of our list, in the database. When we got it out, we just returned whatever it was that we got back. So what I need to do, in fact, is instead of returning just the data, I need to actually turn that into a Python object again. And so here I use JSON loads, load s, for loading some JSON data from a string. So let's go back to the console here. A sub j is my Python string. If I JSON new a, so let's call it a new equals JSON dot loads a sub j, and a new now is a list. A new 0 is 1. So loads, JSON loads, is the opposite of JSON dumps. So dump to a string, load from a string. There's also JSON dump, which is dump to a file, and JSON load, which is load from a file. That's why you have the dump s versions. So what we want to do here is JSON load s from to load the data. So now data will become a Python data structure again, not a list, not a string, and we're going to return the data. Okay, so now we should be returning the Python data structure, and now we get the behavior that we want, which is to append this new item to the list, Steve. Let's say we want to actually update this list. So we want to set the sample. Now we want to actually store this new list, Steve, here that I've appended something to in the database. Let's try and do that. And the problem now that we have is that we've said in the database that the name thing is a primary key, and so we need to we can't just insert a new record with the same primary key, the same name. So what we've got to do in order to make that work is to find out if this thing is already in the database. If it's already in the database, then we need to modify it, and if it's not in the database, then we need to insert it. Let me write that code. Okay, so I've written that code now. What I'm doing is to first I'm going to get the sample, so I'm using get sample to find out the current value, and if that is the empty list, now I'm making an assumption here that I'm not going to store the empty list in my database. And that's actually probably a wrong assumption, but just for now that will work. So if this is this special value, which is the empty list that's returned, then I'm going to say, well, it can't be in the database already, so I'm just going to insert it. So this is the code that I had before. Otherwise, if it is already in the list, I'm going to use an update statement, an SQL update. So this is update sample set data equals something, where name equals something. And again, I'm going to get my new bit of data in JSON format. And so in fact, I could factor that out into the outside the loop here. So we only have one version of it. So now I can execute my query. Notice I've had to flip the items here because data here is first and name is second. And then I'm going to do the commit operation as well. And in fact, we could take that outside the loop as well, couldn't we? So to refactor just a little bit and have it a little bit more compact. So if we have an existing data, then we do an insert, otherwise we do an update statement, and that will modify the data. So with that change, we can run our code again, and what we get is this new version. So here is the version of Steve I've appended 6 to, and then I'm storing that in the database with that update there. Okay, so that's just a little example running through the idea of using JSON to store things in a database. We'll look much more at JSON a little bit later, but it does provide this example, provides a way to store complex data structures, Python data structures, in a database as a string, and then sort of turn them back into Python data structures when you get them out. Hope that's been useful. Thank you.